the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his path. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem.
All right, well, as long as the wind doesn't knock over the building, we'll be okay today, I think. So it's been interesting to look out the window and see the trees swaying. I don't know if you've ever lived out on the West Coast, but it's a very unique feeling to be in an earthquake. And I remember I was once in a corporate meeting with very high-level officials, and the room started swaying, and you'd be amazed how quickly they all dove under the table. They lost their dignity in a hurry. And we looked outside, and you could see the pavement rolling in waves and the trees going like this. So at least this isn't that bad, I guess, so we can be thankful for that. All right, so we are finishing with our last segment of Ruth this morning, and it's been, at least from my perspective, a very enjoyable study. I've enjoyed working through the book together, and I hope that you've enjoyed it as well, as we've seen maybe some unique things that the book holds for us as we look at its literary features and as we see the theology behind it. So today we have a shorter passage, but I want to suggest that there's a lot of very interesting truth contained even here, and even in the genealogy at the end, which most probably more or less skim or skip over. I want to take some time today to explain why I think the genealogy is very important. In fact, serves as the culmination of the book, or the culmination of the book in terms of what God has done. One of my favorite preachers that I enjoy listening to is a man named Sinclair Ferguson, and he's Scottish by birth, and I listened to a sermon of his this week, and it was on the text in Genesis 50:20, if you're familiar with that, where Joseph says to his brothers, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good," kind of an Old Testament Romans 8:28, if you will. And Sinclair Ferguson made this remark, and I thought how true it is, that often our lives look like a jigsaw puzzle that has been thrown onto a table. Right? We see all these pieces, but they seem random, they seem disconnected. We don't maybe understand what God is doing in certain aspects or with events that come along, and so we wonder, why has it turned out this way? But Sinclair mentioned that, whenever a jigsaw puzzle person begins to put together a puzzle, and I must admit I'm not a great puzzle solver, but generally speaking, they all have the same approach, don't they? What do they look for first? Okay, the edges, and particularly the corner pieces, because those are the foundation by which you can begin to put together the frame and then fill in the frame. And I was thinking about that with reference to Ruth, and how the corner pieces have now been put in place. And you can even see this with the 4 words that she uses to describe herself, the journey that she goes on from chapter 1 to chapter 4. The 4 words she uses to describe herself, or is used, other than Moabitess, which is used often, is foreigner. Right? In chapter 2, she first calls herself a foreigner. If we think of chapter 1, she was the outsider from Moab that was more or less to be marginalized by an Orthodox Israelite. She was to be considered dangerous, an outsider, someone you wouldn't normally associate with. Well, then she comes in, she pledges her fealty to Naomi. They come back to Israel together. And in chapter 2, she encounters Boaz. And the word there that she uses to describe herself is a word which essentially means a slave girl, a very low-level servant. That is the lowest echelon of society outside of foreigners. Then in chapter 3, when she comes and approaches Boaz with an offer to ask him to be her goel, her redeemer, to deliver her, she uses a word that means a maidservant. It's one step up. It's not just a slave girl. It's now a servant who is marriageable to the boss, to the master. And now finally in Ruth 4, we see the 4th word, this 4th corner piece, and that is wife. Ruth becomes Boaz's wife, and she's now come full circle, and she's a legitimized member of Israelite society. She's part of Boaz's household. She's come under the wings of Boaz for protection. Her her kinsman redeemer, her family deliverer. So today we want to look at the culmination of the story and this moment when they come together and they are wed, and we see what follows. God is blessing. And I want to point out as we work through this today how many items have come full circle in the book. We'll remember a lot from chapter 1 because remember, Naomi comes back empty-handed and she says, "The Lord has embittered me. I'm left with nothing." And we'll see this morning that she's now filled back up. She's restored. She's brought back into favor and fullness. All right, so let's begin. Let's look at this passage. If you have the handout in front of you, you can follow as I read this translation. Beginning in verse 13, Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He went into her. The Lord granted her conception. Just a note here, this is only the second time in the book where the Lord directly does something. He did something in chapter 1. He visited his people to provide bread, and now he grants conception. So he's at the beginning and at the end. Really, he was there the whole time. And she bore a son. The women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not withheld from you a redeemer today." This idea of withhold has the sense of causing something to stop or to hold it back or to refrain. He has not kept back this redeemer. May his name be perpetuated in Israel. He will become for you a restorer of life, literally a returner of life. Remember chapter 1, the key word was return, and the question was, where are they returning to? Well, now this child will be a returner or restorer of life and a supporter in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you has borne him. She is better to you than 7 sons. That's the ideal number of sons in the ancient world. Naomi took the child and placed him on her bosom and became his nanny. Now that may be an unusual translation, but it's the best sense of what's happening. She's his caregiver. The neighbor ladies gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They called his name Obed, which means servant. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. All right, so we have here the conclusion, the climax. A child is born unto you, a son is given. Right? We have this delivery of the child who will be the deliverer. And so, and then we have a genealogy tracing how this line from Perez, and remember, there's a lot of imagery here from Tamar and Judah and Perez, that story back in Genesis 38. And so he heads the genealogy here, leading up to David. The last word of the book is David. It's kind of left hanging there that David came as a result of this union. All right, so I want to take a moment just to hear from you. What are some observations you make about this text as we work through? Is there anything here that is that stands out in terms of what you think might be key words, key thoughts, repeated ideas, anything that you think the narrator is emphasizing here in this narrative? What do you think? Anyone? Okay. Restorer of life. And this is one of the reasons we said at the beginning that the book is ultimately about Naomi, it would seem, right? Because it's her life that gets restored. She's the one who's been emptied, and now she's refilled. All right, anyone else?
The generations mentioned, there's 7 generations at the end, which is
Right. Okay, we'll talk about the idea of the genealogy and what function that has. It's a very important aspect of the book in terms of laying out this line, this chosen line. James, you have a thought?
Also, the book ends on David and talks about the line of Judah and everything, ties it in very closely with the whole, royal line of Judah narrative leading eventually to Christ. It also seems to imply the book was either written or at least amended sometime after David was anointed.
Right. Right, so we would think it's probably during the monarchy, maybe even later. So David's around and seems to be a well-known figure, at least, when this book's written. All right, good. Any other ideas? Any other observations or thoughts, Alma?
Ruth seems to just kind of fade to the back.
Yep. She does. She's really, in some senses, accomplished her purpose in the sense of being a primary character, but of course, she is significant in the sense that she bears the son, but then the camera lens seems to focus back again on Naomi, and she becomes the central character. Really, this is for her because she's come full circle now, where she had been empty and now she's refilled. All right, good. Ryan?
I was going to say, it's interesting, it's another one of those times where there's a danger to the line and God intervenes. Like you have, the patriarchs, wives that were infertile and God allows them to have children. And now you have a situation here where the line's in danger, that's going to lead to David and eventually Messiah, and God.
Right. Yeah, it's a familiar theme in the Old Testament. There are instances where it looks like the line will be wiped out, and in one case they're only left with one child who's abducted more or less and preserved and later becomes king, but at times it looks very ominous, like it's about to go out, and God graciously intervenes to keep it. Charles?
Isn't I correct to say that Rahab is in there somewhere?
Right, so she would be married to Salmon in verse 21.
So in that story, the thread, which is just I was impressed by, the thread that I don't know, just of her and her whole family.
Right. Yeah, yes, it's this line of grace. We have women like Rahab and Tamar, who were both likely Canaanite women, and both engaged in activity that would be considered scandalous. But God, in His grace, intervenes.
It's like listed all through the first chapter of Matthew. It's just really amazing.
Yeah. Yep, it is. It's pretty awesome. Terry?
Like from today's, what Pastor Jim was preaching on, those who mourn, they will be comforted. And we see this exactly here because I think that Naomi was mourning more than we could imagine, or maybe as we could imagine if anybody suffered death like that. But she was almost out of heart. And in the end, he comforted her. Sometimes you think maybe she didn't have enough faith, or maybe she should have acted a different way, but he was gentle with her and
Right.
restored her.
Yeah, He did. It doesn't mean there wasn't pain along the way, but in the end, God restores her. And we know that ultimately that will be the case. We don't always see it happen maybe as we expected, or perhaps even in our lifetime. We don't always know how the Lord's doing that, but He's working all things together in His providential grace. Ben?
At least two things I noticed. One, by listing out this genealogy here, it shows that there wasn't other generations during the time of Judges that did fall away, that this particular line stayed righteous from the time of coming into the land until David. And so, unlike the rest of Israel, we can see that there wasn't anyone else in there to create a down and up cycle of falling away and coming back, that there was an unbroken chain of righteousness. And along that same lines, Ruth is very interesting just overall, that there was nothing cyclical in this. There was pretty much from down to up, pretty steady increase, unlike the rest of the time of Judges and the other books that would have been happening at the same time that would have gone down and up and down, that it was pretty much just a steady rise.
Okay. No cycle in the sense of falling into apostasy and
Yes.
coming back and all that, right? Okay, very good. So, yes, this is something to think about, which is fairly remarkable if you read this against the foil of the Judges and how dark those days are. And yet we have from Boaz to David this line of faithfulness to the Lord. And, you know, maybe you come from a family where you have a heritage of godliness, and maybe you don't. On my side, my father's side, I don't. On my mother's side, I do. But it's a great heritage to have faithful generations who can bequeath the faith and a life of integrity to later generations, particularly living in a day of apostasy like the Judges, or even like our day. We live in a day very similar to the time of the Judges. All right, any other thoughts or observations? Terry?
One last thought for me is that it used to be, before all this, that God was the center, and there was a theocracy where he was the leader, and then the people sinned, and they wanted kings. So they got a king, but he wasn't of this line. But God is providing a righteous king, I guess that would be David. But even at that, it was still a king, and he really wants to be the center. But even as you go down through that line, you're going to end up with Christ, who will be back to a theocracy, I guess.
Right. Yeah, he'll be a king in the sense of when he reigns, particularly. So yes. And it's interesting how much David is associated with this idea of loyal love and faithfulness. If you read the Psalms and the Psalter, how many of David's Psalms emphasize this theme, even what Pastor Jim read this morning, just about loving kindness and faithfulness. And David should have in particular understood this because his own family story embodied grace and love and faithfulness. And so he can look back at his ancestors and see it very clearly. All right, anyone else? Yeah.
Just a question, well, maybe not a question, but I thought it was interesting that it says the neighbor ladies gave him a name.
Yeah.
Because I know this is not tradition of the family to, I wonder what the purpose of that is in the story.
Yes. Good catch. Let's talk about that in a second. All right, so the neighbor ladies have a function here. If you've read many Greek plays, for instance, or even Shakespeare, he often has a character called the chorus, right? That someone who, or a group that maybe adds something to the storyline by giving some background information. And so here, this function is served by the neighbor ladies, that is the women around Naomi. And what I think is interesting here is, as Lori mentioned, it's very unusual for them to be the ones to name the child. Typically it would be the parents, typically often the father. So what function does this have? It seems to, at least in one aspect, form what we would call an inclusio. What I mean by that is, at the opening and at the end, the neighbor ladies are associated with naming. If you look back at chapter 1, remember when Naomi comes back and everyone's saying, "Is this Naomi?" Chapter 1, verse 19. She comes into town bedraggled, and she's carrying the weight of the years she's been away. She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara," which means bitterness. The Lord, the Almighty, has dealt very bitterly toward me. And then she goes on, "I went away full, the Lord's brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity," literally that's evil, "upon me." So what's interesting, at the beginning of the book, the neighbor ladies rename Naomi at her request Mara, and now they give a name to Obed, the child. And so at the beginning and the end, they're associated with naming. But it is very interesting. They serve really to highlight that this book is about the blessing God shows toward Naomi. She's the one who's restored to life and sustained in this instance. All right, good. Good observations. Others? Yeah, Matt?
I just thought, again, the mention of Ruth in this last text, the daughter-in-law, verse 15, who loves you. So her love for Naomi is pointed out there too. I thought that was interesting. And I think people have kind of mentioned it, but the fact that she was a Moabitess, an outsider, it looks like a foreshadowing of the gospel. Those who are near and those who are far, a unification of Gentile and Jew together.
Right.
I thought that's really interesting to me.
It is. We've hinted at that a little bit, but it's fascinating. This is associated with Pentecost, and that was a festival where they used leavened bread, 2 loaves, which seems to symbolize perhaps Gentile inclusion. And we have this idea now of, I think, a foreshadowing of the gospel, yes, that the outsider comes near and is brought into the family. And Ephesians 2, of course, brings this idea to full flower when Paul shows how we've been brought into the family and brought near because of Christ. So it's a great, great thought. Alman?
Is there a Hebrew meaning behind Obed?
Yes, servant. It's a participle, he who serves or the one who serves. So, I'll talk about that in a moment, but the sense, I think, is he will be a servant to sustain Naomi. He's her social security, if you will, because there's no check coming in the mail. So Obed will be the one to serve her and to work. He's the servant of the Lord in that sense. All right, any other thoughts? Yes, Rachel.
I thought it was neat how in verse 11, how he refers to Rachel and Leah, and how with Rachel, she was barren for so long, but then the Lord allows her to conceive. And then how in verse 13, the Lord gives her conception, and she was never barren, but I think it's just God overabounding with his blessing on their lives.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And in fact, many commentators say, and this may be true, it's hard to know for sure, but many speculate that she was married to Mahlon for up to 10 years with no children. So it's possible she was considered barren. So if that's the case, that would show that when Boaz agrees to take her as his wife, it's an even riskier venture because she is perhaps the barren widow. And so Boaz shows his kindness and love even to a greater extent there. So the comparisons are fairly remarkable. All right, these are great observations. Did I see any other hands or thoughts? Okay, well, good. Let's work through this a little bit, and we'll bring out some things as we go along. All right, so Boaz takes Ruth, and now we have the culmination here, the consummation of this union. And the language here at verse 13 is typical of wedding. When the man takes the woman, this is a common euphemism for marriage. So the idea is simply that they were married, she became his wife. And then it says he went into her. This is a euphemism for having intimate sexual relations as the consummation of the marriage. And so this metaphor is entering into the bridal chamber, if you will. So the idea is they've come together, and then it says the Lord granted her conception. This is a very unusual phrase. This word conception isn't really used very often in the Old Testament. There are about 3 times that it's used, and here is the only time where directly the idea is that the Lord grants conception. Of course, we know from the story of Hannah with Samuel, we have a similar scenario. But here, the Lord directly intervenes. And as I said, at the beginning and end of the book, he directly intervenes to bring about his purposes. But of course, he's been doing that all along, right? We know through the characters of the book, through Boaz, he's been bringing blessing to Ruth. And in fact, I had mentioned this earlier, that every prayer that's uttered in the book is answered. And it's answered by human agents who are faithful to the Lord, who express some prayer wish, and then often they themselves function to fulfill that, to bring it to pass. And so we see that here as well. So it's likely she's been barren for about 10 years, if all of that background idea that we put together is true. And so the Lord intervenes again and gives her conception, and she bears a son. Then it's interesting, isn't it, that the focus shifts in verse 14. Now it's the women talking to Naomi, and they have a conversation here. And the focus goes back to Naomi as it was at the beginning. So it's kind of come full circle. And just compare this, if you will, to how Naomi speaks at the beginning. What are the women saying here? Blessed be the Lord who has not withheld from you a redeemer. How does this compare with Naomi's own speech in chapter 1? You remember I read that. She said there that don't call me pleasant, or Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. And you remember when we went through chapter 1, I talked about how the term she uses for Almighty is El Shaddai. And in Genesis, El Shaddai is always associated with fertility and blessing. So it's almost as if she's suggesting that this God who is supposed to bless and give fertility has robbed me of my offspring. He's taken it all away, and now I'm a bitter, middle-aged woman returning home to die. And now we see it's come full circle where the women, the chorus is saying, blessed be the Lord, that the Lord has restored you. He's given you a redeemer today. Now the question that immediately comes to mind is, who is the redeemer? So verse 14, blessed be the Lord who has not withheld from you a redeemer today. May his name be perpetuated in Israel. Now you might read that and immediately think, who is the redeemer? Maybe Boaz, right? Because he's been the redeemer, the kinsman, family deliverer throughout. But do you think that's who they're talking about here? Because you'll notice this is immediately after the birth of the son, and they use the word today. So who do you think that they're talking about? There are actually three possibilities. They could be saying the Lord has redeemed in some sense, although that may not be as likely. Or Boaz, or what's the third possibility? Obed, the child. The child. So I would suggest that Obed is in fact the Redeemer in this verse. And so they're saying the Lord is blessed because he has given you a Redeemer today. A Redeemer. So what's interesting about Ruth is when we think of kinsman Redeemer, as it associates with the book of Ruth, who do we immediately always think of? Boaz, right? So Boaz is kind of the consummate family deliverer. But really, in reality, there are several redeemers in this book. Ruth herself is something of a redeemer because she goes to the field to gather grain, and she's the one who takes the initiative with Boaz to consummate this relationship, to bring back blessing to the family line. So Ruth is something of a redemptive figure, and now Obed, the servant, seems to be mentioned here as the Redeemer. Then they follow this with this phrase, may his name be perpetuated in Israel. Literally, this is the idea, may his name be called out in Israel. Now, why do you think that they would give this blessing? What sort of significance would this have? May his name be called out or perpetuated or pronounced, proclaimed. You could almost translate it, may his name be renowned. Okay, so what sort of a wish are they hoping for here? If we thought it was Boaz at the beginning, that might make sense, right? Because remember back in the earlier discussions, Boaz wanted the name to be perpetuated. But now if this is referring to Obed, how is it that his name will be perpetuated? Any thoughts? Anybody have any thoughts about that? The significance here of this?
Maybe the lineage of the king to come, David.
Okay.
The fact that it's because of Boaz and all the answered prayers that his name is renowned, because not only did David come, but when we talk about Christ, he refers to David as being in the fleshly lineage of David, and therefore Boaz again gets propped up. So
Right. And I think David is probably, outside of Moses, the most important character of the Old Testament, we'd have to say. He gets the most face time in the Psalter, in the narrative, so he's a very significant figure. So the idea of perpetuating the name, this was a very serious concern for Israelites. They didn't want their name to be forgotten. They had a tradition that you speak the name of the deceased to perpetuate their memory so that the memory is not eclipsed and forgotten. In fact, I have a picture on my shelf in my office of my grandfather who died when I was 10 years old in 1985. He died of kidney failure, and part of the reason I have that picture there, of course, is to remember him. He was a POW during World War II and did some amazing things during the war and all of that. But it's also a kind of a grave reminder that how quickly our own memory fades. Right? We talked about this a few weeks ago when we looked at death in Ecclesiastes, this idea that we're all headed toward the grave unless the Lord returns first. But someday we will be there, and how much will we be remembered? What's our legacy? If we're realistic about it, probably not as much as we would hope or think. We may not actually be as important as we think we are, amazingly. We're probably going to be quickly forgotten, right? That's the reality of it. So it's a sobering thing, and their wish here is for that not to happen, for the name to be perpetuated. And that, in fact, does happen because we're still talking about them today. Thousands of years later, across the ocean, in a very different culture, we're calling out their names. We're remembering them because the Lord answered even this prayer and perpetuated the name. And if you think about it, Obed becomes not just the grandfather of David, but think of all of David's important cousins, such as Joab, Abishai, Asahel, and these guys who were cousins of David through Zeruiah, David's actually nephews, through his sister, his older sister, who was a daughter of Jesse. So at any rate, he was the grandfather of many significant, important people in the land. All right, someone else have a thought, or did I hear something else? Okay. All right, so his name is to be perpetuated. That's their prayer. And then they continue, he will become for you a restorer of life and a supporter in your old age. Okay, as I mentioned before, this is it's really a reversal of chapter 1. The key term in chapter 1 was return, 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 and now he's going to return her life and be a supporter to her. Literally, this is to sustain or to nourish her in her old age. Now, how would he do that? How would he sustain her? Well, again, a widow was very destitute in ancient Israel, right? They didn't have much government assistance of any kind. They didn't have anything to fall back on, so they were very much dependent on their family and the generosity of relatives. And so in this case, they're saying Naomi is set because this child will care for her in her old age. He will restore her life. All right, and then they make a remarkable statement, and this is very rare. I can think of only one other instance where this sort of a statement is made when Elkanah says to Hannah that he should be better to her than 10 sons. But here the idea is Ruth is better than 7 sons. Now, that's a pretty remarkable statement if you think about it as if you were an ancient Israelite, right? 7 being the ideal number. If you have 7 sons, you are kind of seen as having a full progeny of descendants who will perpetuate your name and carry on your name. And here, Ruth is compared to being better than 7 sons. Now, how can they say that? Is that just hyperbole? Do you think that they're exaggerating a little bit, or what are they implying by saying that Ruth is better than 7 sons? What do you think? Is this true or just an exaggeration? How is Ruth being better than 7 sons?
Well, Ruth cared for Naomi. She took care of her, and she gave her sustenance by working and getting the grain and everything.
Okay.
And then it leads on to having the child that Naomi brings back the pleasant and the happy to Naomi.
Right. Right. So Ruth shows stick-to-itiveness, devotion to Naomi. It probably wouldn't even be the case with sons. You know, sons tend to go out of the house and fly away, sort of thing. But Ruth has been devoted, and so her chesed, her loving kindness, is very faithful. Ben?
It definitely is true that she's better than 7 sons for her. I don't know if they necessarily knew that they were making almost a prophetic statement, because the point of sons was to carry on the name of the father. And Ruth carried on Naomi's line to David, and we know to Christ.
Right.
Meaning that he is perpetuated forever.
Right.
More than simply 7 sons could do that. The name happened would survive if some didn't have kids or married barren women or whatever happened. It absolutely was true in almost a prophetic sense, whether or not they knew it.
Right. So it could be hyperbole, but it's really true in the sense that she gives her, Naomi, a line which will eclipse any sort of perpetuation of the name by virtue of the fact that David is the most famous king, and his line leads to royalty in Judah and ultimately to Christ. So you think about all the significance down the line: Uzziah, Hezekiah, Josiah, Zerubbabel, all of these significant figures who come through this line. And so she's the mother of royalty. In ancient Israel, the queen mother was the most important woman because the wife of the king had some standing, but the queen mother was really important. She even, it seemed, dictated some policy. And so Ruth is kind of like this royal queen mother who bequeaths royalty through her line. All right. Yes, Lou.
I just wanted to know, I thought kinsman redeemer raised up the son or the children to Malon. I mean,
Right.
Why did that not happen?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know if I fully know the answer, I'll be honest, because some of this is mysterious. It seems that he would be responsible for perpetuating the family property, for caring for Naomi, for keeping the house, if you will, everything in the family, because it would seem that the land had reverted to someone else when Elimelech and Naomi left. And so if I'm understanding this correctly, and talked about this a little bit last week, Naomi wants to buy back the rights to that property, but she doesn't have enough capital to do so. So she gives up her right to the land to whoever can redeem it, and this is what Boaz is doing. He's leasing back the land, if you will, because property was different in ancient Israel. It was everyone was considered to be a land tenant, a tenant farmer of Yahweh. Yahweh owned all the land, but families could keep parcels of it until Jubilee, and if you lost it, it would come back to you. And so there's a resistance to Donald Trump types, for lack of a better word, where you're a real estate mogul and you amass massive properties. So within this, it would seem that I'm not sure how he's viewed as perpetuating Elimelech's line, but he at least seems to have come back in a way to redeem the property and to be the one who will keep it in the family. Now, as far as the genealogy goes, though, it would seem that Boaz becomes the proactive one now, who his descendants, rather than Mahlon's, are seen as carrying forward that royal sense. So I have to admit, the genealogies sometimes are difficult because I think there's more going on than we always know. But in this case, it seems like the genealogy part is through Boaz, but the establishment of the house is pertinent to Naomi and Elimelech's line. But that's a great question. All right, did I see another hand? Ryan?
Well, I was going to say, too, with the 7 being the number of perfection, and the 7 sons would provide, complete security for a lady.
Right.
I'm set up, I'm good.
Right.
If a couple of them die, there's still a couple going to provide. So it seems, too, that there's this sense that, she's set, she's provided for.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of an idealized number here. Job comes to mind with his children. But yes, she's cared for. Ruth has provided that because of the offspring. All right. Okay, so they make this statement, and then we have this interesting thing that Naomi does. Naomi takes the child, and many translations render this that she placed him on her lap. I've translated it more literally, and I just want to talk about this for a moment. What's going on here? She takes the child, places him on her bosom, and became his nanny. That word there can be translated nurse. It's the idea of a caregiver or someone who brings up the child, a nanny or whatever words might be used, au pair, different ideas there. She's caring for the child. Now it would almost seem, you could read verse 16 and come away with the idea that Naomi literally nurses the child. That is, lays him to her breast and nurses the child. But that's not what is in view here, it would seem. There's a different word that would describe that. But the sense of it is she takes the child and accepts the child, and he's a restoration for her. Some have suggested, all the men in her life had been removed from her bosom, and now Obed comes back into her bosom as the replacement for her. So the idea is she's accepting the child and she's caring for the child. Now another question comes up, is this a legal adoption right? Some suggest that she's saying this child is her own and adopting the child. The difficulty is we don't know enough of ancient Israelite custom to know if definitively that's the case. Others say she's not adopting the child because the child's already hers. The child's already related to her in some way, although through marriage. So it's difficult to know, but I will say it seems that it's more than just a grandmotherly sentiment, that the narrator here is specifically telling us that she does something which has significance in terms of accepting the child. So whether or not this is a legal adoption, I'm not sure that it is, but she's at least being restored and signifying this child is the deliverer in some sense who's restoring the family fortunes, who's going to be my comfort, and so she takes care of the child, takes him under her wing. All right, so Naomi has come full circle, as we saw, empty to full. She recognizes this child, and she shows that she's accepted him, and he will be significant in the story. Okay, so then it ends. The neighbor ladies give him a name. This is significant because this almost never happens. But what is interesting is another occasion where someone outside the family names the child is, and you may not remember this, but Perez. He is named by the midwife. Do you remember that story? In Genesis 38, let's go back there just by way of refreshment real quickly here. Perez and Zerah are born. They're twins, and it's a remarkable situation where one comes out first, goes back in, and then the other one comes out later. Let's see if I can find. Okay, verse 27. When the time of her labor came, this is Tamar, there were twins in her womb, and when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out, and she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward his brother came out with the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. Okay, so similarly, the midwife makes a statement which becomes his name. The name Perez means to break forth or to burst forth, Peretz in Hebrew. So that's interesting that Perez here, again, is something like Obed, where named by the ladies who are attendant at his birth. And so very interesting. All right, so let's just quickly, as our time's almost up here, we have a couple minutes left, let's talk about this genealogy. Then we have this ending genealogy. Now, critical scholars will say this was added much later after the book was written. Some author came along and said, hey, now that David's come, we should add this genealogy so that everybody knows how important this was. I would demur that I think the opposite, that the genealogy is a very important aspect of the book. And I think it serves several functions. One is to unite back to Genesis and to look forward to Kings. So I'll talk about that in a second. But we have here a 10-member genealogy starting with Perez. Now, an immediate question is, why is Perez the first name? Shouldn't it be Judah? Why is it Perez? Does anybody know? Have a thought? Yeah.
Kind of going back to the story, the verse before which you started reading in Genesis 38, Judah exclaims to Tamar, "You have been more righteous than I."
Right.
And I don't know if that particularly has anything to do with it, but it's definitely a key factor because Judah notices his own selfishness and sin in his heart.
Right.
And he sort of puts Tamar up and says, you have been more righteous.
Right. I think it has almost everything to do with that particular situation. That Perez, if you think about it, and I don't mean to give too much credence, but the idea is it's almost a miraculous conception in the sense that Tamar is not given the next son of Judah, and so she has to, through her own maneuvering, find a way to perpetuate the line, much like Obed is something of a miraculous conception, and that the Lord directly intervenes to bring about this child. So there are remarkable similarities to Perez. We looked at this earlier. There are remarkable similarities between Ruth and Tamar, this royal imagery that's in both books. Tamar takes Judah's staff and ring and cord, and these are royal images, and so there are a lot of connections. So one answer might be the narrator wants us again to be thinking of Perez as a counterpart to Obed. Now there are other reasons. One is this genealogy seems to follow the normal formula of 10 members. And there's significance to this. Let me just point out, I have a lot of, in smaller font, print at the bottom. But I think this is really interesting stuff. And I love genealogies. I love all the stuff, all the parts of the Bible that nobody else really likes. Because I think there's so much in there that's interesting. Beyond just the prayer of Jabez in that book, there's a lot of great stuff in here. All right, so when you look at genealogies, there are really two main types. My first point here, there are linear genealogies and there are segmented genealogies. I don't know if you've ever heard of this terminology, but it's very important when you're reading Genesis to look at the different types. The linear genealogy is found in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. And the significance here is one ancestor is named as the father of another descendant, and it goes on one by one by one. A segmented genealogy, on the other hand, has a father with multiple sons, and then each son is traced in his descendants. The difference being the linear genealogies are always tracing the chosen line, if you will, the main line of redemptive significance, the chosen seed. And it carries royal undertones. The segmented genealogies are all the other nations
They're incidental to the story. They have some importance, but they really form a backdrop for the continuation of the chosen seed. All right, so the linear genealogies are important. As I note in that last sentence, they have prospective, even messianic hopes for the chosen line with royal overtones, and they highlight descendants who have a special relationship with the Lord and are sustained by God's gracious intervention. All right, now, drilling down even a little bit more, I just want to talk about how Genesis 5 and 11 are paradigms for this genealogy. It's typical within a genealogy to have 10 members. If we went back to Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 and looked at those in detail, which I've done over the weekend, and you can take my word for it, there are 10 members in each. So it's significant. Why are there 10? When there are 10, the focus is typically on the 7th and the 10th, right? 7 and 3 are important numbers in the Old Testament, in the Bible in general. 7 and 3. So 7 and 3 equals 10. 10 generations. In Genesis, there are 10 headings. These are the generations of, which function as a structural heading, 10. And so genealogies also highlight 10. All right, I note here that linear genealogies also signal the beginning of a new epic. So for instance, Genesis 5 goes creation to flood. Genesis 11 goes flood to the birth of Abraham. And here, Ruth 4 goes exile in Egypt. Perez was a generation that went to Egypt, to birth of King David. So it seems to be suggesting this is the beginning of a new era, a new epic in Israel's history. The royalty has come, the legitimate king. And they serve to legitimate the final descendant. So in a certain sense, this book is about David. He's the climax, the last word of the book. The last word you hear ringing in your ears is David. So ultimately, the book is getting to him by many tortuous paths along the way. All right, what's also interesting, and this is where a lot of Jewish writers have pointed out some interesting stuff, some significant stuff. If you follow the genealogical storyline from the beginning, from Adam, the 10th is Noah, the 20th is Abraham, Boaz is the 30th. Okay, so it seems to have some significance there. If you jump then to Matthew, Uzziah, who was one of the few good kings in Israel, his name means the Lord is my strength, the Lord has made me strong. He's the 40th. Abiad, who comes back from the exile, is 50th, and Jesus Christ is 60th. Interesting. If you follow how that word toledo is used, this seems to link back with Genesis. As I said, if you've read Genesis and you carefully notice the headings, you'll find this phrase, these are the generations of so-and-so. And that's a structural device. It's kind of like an outline, and there are 10 structural headings. What this does is it says Ruth is a bridge in the primary history of Genesis to Kings. In other words, from Genesis through Kings, Ruth is a very important segue between the early generations, the patriarchs, and now the royalty, the Davidic monarchy. Okay, so it's very important in that sense. All right, and then let me just end by saying this, that genealogies serve a symbolic function. They connote completion, fullness, and divine providence, and there are 2 reasons why. Number 1, it would seem that there are large gaps or chronological time spans that these genealogies cover, which may suggest we don't have all the names. Okay, Now, others disagree with this, but as I study it, I've come to the conclusion we have to admit that there probably are gaps in the genealogies. What I mean by this is not every name is necessarily identified. Part of the reason is, as I say here, and I give more arguments for it here, but in at least 2 cases, there's a span of 400 years with 4 ancestors. So unless they're about 100 when they give birth to the next one, they're probably missing someone. Now, there was a Jewish tradition that Boaz was 80 when he married Ruth. He went into her and died on his wedding day, just long enough to conceive a child, and it's an interesting story, probably not true. So at any rate, they recognize that there's these spans of time, so is that a problem for us? I don't think it's a problem for us. What it seems to suggest is they have a formulaic function to show in God's timing, He brings everything to fruition. In God's timing, it's perfect, it's complete, and when He wishes, He brings it to pass. The other thing is, in Luke 3, there's the mention of an individual that's not found in the Hebrew text of Genesis 11, so that also suggests that there is a gap there because Canaan is not mentioned in Genesis as one of the descendants.
Okay, not to burst anybody's bubble. I'm not, suggesting that there are insuperable difficulties here. I'm just saying it's a function of genealogies to highlight the notable descendants. And it's not a problem for us that they don't name every name. They're just naming the prominent ones who are carrying forward the significant family interests, okay? So that seems to be what's going on with the genealogy. So here we have a very important genealogy. It's a bridge genealogy from Perez and the exile in Egypt to David, who establishes the monarchy. He's the signal figure of the Old Testament in many ways, and so Ruth is looking forward to him, and Ruth is prominent in that line. Okay, thoughts or questions about any of that? A lot of information, fire hose stuff at the end there. Everybody's good? All right, well, let's close in prayer, and thank you for your good attention today as we work through the last bits there of Ruth. All right, let's pray. Father, we thank you for another opportunity this morning to study your word, and we just thank you for the truth that we find in it and the encouragement that we find that you work even in what seem like dark circumstances and difficult days to bring about your purposes. And we know that ultimately this is for our good, that you are for us, not against us in Christ. And we're thankful for that. We thank you that redemption was carried forward by these seemingly obscure figures in ancient Israel, but they were very important in terms of your redemptive plan. So we're thankful that even today we can rejoice and perpetuate the names of these individuals who you used to bring about the Messiah, Jesus Christ. We thank you for his work of salvation and atonement on our behalf, and that we can serve you now in newness of life through your Spirit. And I pray, Lord, that you would help us as we think about these truths going forward from today, that you would encourage us to remain faithful in our own spheres of influence and to bring you glory. And so we're thankful and we praise you, and we ask all this in the name of Jesus Christ, our Savior. Amen.